Thank you, Samah, for the intro. I'd like to thank everyone here for being here today, and thank the organizers and the panelists for shedding the light on this very important topic, which is the media, specifically social media and Palestine. In the past few decades, the internet and technology has seeped into almost every corner of our everyday life. It has become an integral part of our day-to-day practices. And digital literacy nowadays is a must-have set of skills almost in every sector. The new media has undoubtedly revolutionized the realm of communication as it brought to the fore new and modern communication practices, where it introduced many-to-many practices in communication, where the audience is usually vague and ambiguous and underspecified, and the consumers are also producers. Many scholars and political scientists argue that the social media has replaced and reconfigured old and conventional methods of political communication. It has changed the interaction from top down to bottom up, and that has given more power and weight to grassroots organizations as well as activists on the ground. But is this the case also in Palestine? I mean, the question is whether social media has had the same effect, the same empowering effect on the Palestinian struggle. Now, the answer for that is yes and no. In some aspects, there's been a positive influence and positive impact of the social media on Palestine. However, there's also been, to a certain extent, a negative influence. However, it is safe to say that the positive impacts have outweighed the negative impacts. I'd like to address first the positive impact and then briefly the negative impact of social media on the Palestinian struggle. Firstly, there are four main advantages of the social media in the Palestinian context. The first one is the fact that it has allowed the Palestinians everywhere to reconnect and reunite with the fragments of the Palestinian nation and society inside as well as outside of Palestine. Palestinians live in complete isolation and divide due to the Israeli policies. So Palestinians in 1948 in Israel almost have, or before the social media, had absolutely no contact to Palestinians in refugee camps or in Gaza or the West Bank. Now, thanks to social media, nowadays that connection is possible. And a Palestinian from Ain al-Hilwi refugee camp in Lebanon can communicate with a Palestinian from Gaza, as well as a Palestinian from Ramallah and Jerusalem, as well as Acre. The second benefit of the social media in the Palestinian context is the fact that it was able to galvanize and mobilize support and create alliances worldwide. Now, how did that happen? First of all, the Palestinians were able to challenge the Zionist propaganda successfully. And by doing that, they were able to shift the public opinion in the West, but also everywhere else in the world, towards the Palestinians. I remember there were specific examples where the Zionist lobby introduced pictures of Gazan homes as houses of Israelis. And the activists were able to challenge that very successfully. Another case where they presented a part of their propaganda, a picture of KLCC, which is a shopping center in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, as a shopping center being in Gaza. And they said, oh, look at these Palestinians, they're lying. Look at this amazing shopping center in Gaza. And luckily for me, my husband's Malaysian, and that's how I managed to actually figure out that this picture, I was wondering, like, where is this picture coming from? This is definitely not Gaza. And then he pointed it out, but also other activists managed to point out the true source of that picture. And of course, we see that in the latest attacks and executions and latest alleged stabbings where soldiers execute Palestinians and then they plant knives next to their bodies, or they shoot them and then they plant knives next to their bodies, as in to justify their attacks. Now, if it wasn't for social media, these kind of information content wouldn't have managed to spread widely. In terms of the shifting the public opinion, there's been a poll in The Economist that said, and I quote, polls show that there's less robust than usual American public support for Israel. An increasing criticism of the state in the United States media, despite devoting unparalleled attention to the media, Israel is losing the propaganda war. So this is something that has been very helpful, and that achievement wouldn't probably, or maybe, I mean, this we can argue, but wouldn't have happened that effectively without the social media. Later on, creating alliances with other grassroots movements and social justice movements around the world. For so long, the Palestinian issue has been marginalized, right? Even there's so many progressives who, they're progressives except for Palestine. So this issue was intentionally kept in the dark and marginalized. The Palestinian activists managed to shift and push the Palestinian struggle from the margins into the spotlight through the use of social media. And in that way, they managed to incorporate the struggle of Palestine into other or major social justice struggles and movements around the world. We've seen such alliances formed between the Palestinian activists and the Black Lives Matter activists in the US. We've seen tweets from Palestinians providing advice on how to deal with tear gas to activists in Ferguson. We've also seen the famous picture of Black Lives Matter activists protesting with Free Palestine t-shirts. So this has been a very good improvement in creating alliances. Another way of mobilizing and creating support was through crowdsourcing, which usually manifests in petitions, like the ones that the activists created to bring Ali to Australia, and to rally and basically promote a specific, or not specific, Palestinian-related topics. Thirdly, the third advantage of social media is the ability to organize internally in a better and more efficient way. So the social media has been a platform and an apparatus for Palestinians inside Palestine to better communicate, connect, coordinate, and organize internally. And of course, organize and mobilize support and recruit people and participants for events such as protests, marches, and so on and so forth. We've seen those examples happening in Palestine, but also in the Arab world when it comes to the Arab Spring. But specifically in Palestine, in the weekly protest against the apartheid wall, but also in the power plant struggle against the power plant that aimed at forcefully evicting Palestinians in the Naqab from their homes. The fourth advantage of social media is that it basically it presented an alternative news outlet and resource for Palestinians. So nowadays, they can listen to the mainstream media, of course, but you have an alternative source that provides information that come directly from the ground, right? So this has been very empowering, and this has created the citizen journalism phenomena. And this, of course, has been a very good thing for Palestinians, but also for people worldwide, so that they can get the opportunity to see what happens in Palestine from Palestinians directly. Now, moving on to the negative impacts. There are two main drawbacks, the way I see it, when it comes to the social media and Palestine. The first one is slacktivism, as we like to call it, right? So slacktivism basically is when individuals engage in symbolic acts of solidarity. So you like the specific page on Facebook, or you like someone's video or post, and even though you are engaging in a political discourse, you're not really actually bringing change on the ground, right? And many people argue that, and they say that, oh, the Arab Spring, thanks to Facebook, and Facebook basically created, and it's not true. The revolution happened, yes, I mean, Facebook facilitated the communication, but the revolution happened in Tahrir Square on the ground. So that's one of the things that people tend to think. I mean, there's a debate around selectivism too, and others argue that it still makes an impact. However, on the ground, that is not enough. It's not sufficient. The second drawback would be the political polarization that is created by the filter bubble, right? So the infrastructure of social media is not biased, is not neutral, right? There's a certain algorithm that functions and that promotes like-minded opinions and like-minded people. And in the case of Palestine, polarization, this is the last thing that we need, right? So now that I've addressed the negative impact, I'd like to move on into my next question, which is, how has been Israel's reaction to that, right? So we've seen that the social media has given so much power to Palestinians. What's been, Israel up to when it comes to these matters? So lately, there's been massacres with the general security service in Israel and the military army. They don't have a clear-cut definition of what makes an incitement on Facebook. So it can either be liking someone's status, or it can be sharing a certain video, or it can be sharing a quote from someone, right? So it's very unclear, and yet even though they don't have a clear-cut definition, they can't really try them on that grounds, they have been keeping these people under administrative detention. The second Israel, I mean, it's not new, but the other thing that Israel's been up to, and they've been doing that for so long, which is basically monitoring the online sphere, but now it's been increasing. So they're monitoring and they're working with their meeting. There was a report on Ma'arif that they met with Google and YouTube offices in order to create or establish a joint working mechanism to basically filter and restrict the spread and the dissemination of what they call, again, inflammatory material on Facebook. Now, moving on into the last point of my talk, and this point was addressed by the audience, actually, in mainstream media, is pretty much hardcore Zionism, right? It has embraced entirely the Zionist discourse and the Zionist narrative without even trying to question. Narrative isn't necessarily the right thing to do for any journalist or any, that's not professional journalism, and that's not responsible journalism. And the reason for that is that we all know that the Israeli media goes through military censorship. So there is a censor that sits there before the 8 o'clock news, and they just manage and they decide what things and what content goes on and what content doesn't. So reflecting that side is basically not only reflecting Zionism, it's reflecting militant Zionism, right? So when it comes to the context, of course, there's no acknowledgement of the root causes of the problem. So the story always begins when the Palestinian react, right? Oh, look at this Palestinian. All of a sudden, they woke up one day and they thought to themselves, well, what a nice day for getting shot in the head. I'm gonna go get a kitchen knife and just go, And like basically detaching whatever happens from the context is wrong and is flawed. There's no mention of the 68 years of occupation, land confiscation, ethnic cleansing, the ongoing ethnic cleansing, and all of that. There's no mention. You just listen to the news and you think to yourself, I mean, if I wasn't Palestinian, I'd be like, why do they do that? Really, that's weird. What, that doesn't provide context for you to understand what happens. In terms of terminology and the jargon that is used when it comes to Palestinians and describing Palestinians, of course, terrorism and associating them with terrorism and all of these. So it's not, again, it's obviously biased. It's clear for me that it's biased. They don't call them attacks. They call them terrorist attacks, right? They don't use objective terminology. They use very biased Zionist terminology. in terms of interviewing mostly Israeli experts, right? You see all these Israeli experts provided platform, and experts again, right? And they have enough time and enough platform to speak and to express and to say what they think and to provide analysis, whereas very imbalanced, and again, it's very imbalanced because very few Palestinians get to do that in the Australian mainstream media. And lastly, and this is something that's been very frustrating for a Palestinian to hear, but again, I mean, it's something that we're used to. This whole false link between Palestine and ISIS, right? Between Gaza and ISIS. So they try, even tacitly, but also openly, creating this false connection between Palestinians or Palestine sympathizers and ISIS. There's been a case of this Australian teenager who joined ISIS, and I was reading the article covering that specific piece of news, and it says he was very, he sympathized, I don't know how they put it, but the bottom line is that he sympathized with Gazans, and that's why he was very upset by the coverage of the mainstream media in Australia, and that's why he joined ISIS. So it kind of it deprives people from the very natural and organic human feeling of feeling sympathy towards people that are living under bombs and occupation and surviving. So it's very dangerous, I think, what has happened in the mainstream media. So for me, again, I think we all need to push, and we all need to hold there are certain standards that every journalist and every media outlet should be held responsible for, which are professionalism and responsibility. The Zionist narrative is very exclusionist, it's very racist, and it is very aggressive, right? Reflecting that kind of narrative in the Australian media does not promote peace anywhere. That's not good for anyone, right? Specifically the victims who have to suffer from these kind of practices, and also the mainstream media needs to be aware that there is a considerable amount of Muslim community and Arab community living here in Australia, and they need to think about that coverage when they discuss the Palestinian issue. So thank you, everyone. That would be it. Yeah.